All right, let's go ahead and kick things off. Paul, if you want to unshare your screen for a second, I'll go ahead and do a little intro before you jump in. All right, everybody. First of all, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm so glad you're here with us tonight. We have a big crowd joining us, which is wonderful to see. My name is Bea Redfield, and I'm the executive director of the Chaco Culture Conservancy. On behalf of the board and our partners at the National Park Service, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and coming together to learn about Chaco this holiday season. We are thrilled to be kicking off this new lecture series tonight. This is just the beginning, and we have some more truly incredible speakers lined up this spring in addition to Paul. So I'm going to be announcing a few of those after today's talk, so be sure to stay after the credits. And feel free, like I said, to drop any questions in the Q&A as we go. We're going to answer as many of those as we can after the lecture. And if we don't get to any, I'm going to write down those questions and I'll follow up with a separate email to you all later with the answers to those. So keep an eye on your inbox. I'll also have the recording to tonight's lecture available once it's on our YouTube channel, and that'll be in that email. Okay, so for those of you who might be new to the Greater Chaco and Chaco Culture Conservancy, a quick word about who we are. The Conservancy is the official nonprofit partner or friends group supporting both Chaco and Aztec National Parks. Our role is to support these parks and fill in federal support gaps through stewardship programs, research support, community connections, you name it. Wherever the parks need support, that's where we come in as the Friends Group. Which brings me to tonight's speaker and to you all and the community connection we're making here tonight. We truly could not have imagined a better way to begin this speaker series than with Paul. We are so honored to welcome Paul Reed tonight. Paul has been a preservation archaeologist with Archaeology Southwest since 2001. He currently lives in north of Taos here in New Mexico. And over the course of his career, Paul has worked extensively with Southwestern Pueblos and tribes to protect culturally significant landscapes and critically to help elevate Indigenous voices in conversations about preservation and place. In 2002, Paul partnered with filmmaker David Wallace to produce the short documentary Protecting Chaco's 10-Mile Zone, which features Navajo and Pueblo cultural leaders speaking directly about what the Greater Chaco landscape means to them. And that film was actually awarded a regional Emmy in 2023. So, Emmy Award winner alert tonight, kind of a big deal. For more than 15 years, Paul has also been deeply involved in efforts to protect the Greater Chaco landscape from the impacts of expanded oil and gas development. Working alongside tribal and nonprofit partners, his focus has been on strengthening protections for sites across the San Juan Basin. And if you know Paul, you know he brings a rare combination of very deep knowledge, hands-on experience, and long-term relationship building to this work. And we are so grateful to have him with us tonight. And with that, I'll hand it over to you to get us started, Paul.
Great. Thank you so much, B. I'm thrilled that we started talking about this a couple of weeks ago and that this is something that you wanted to do. So thanks so much to you, B, and to the Chaco Culture Conservancy, and of course to my employers, Archaeology Southwest, for all of their support over the years. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so to everyone tuned in, thank you for coming out here on Christmas Eve, if we can call it that. I'm thrilled to be here again and to be helping to kick off the series. I personally feel like there is no more important place, perhaps, in the realm of area that I've been able to work over 40 years of the career. So I'm thrilled. And any of you who know me know that I don't need really much of an excuse at all to dive into and talk about really one of my favorite places, Chaco Canyon. Great. I'm going to hold on. We're having some wonderful tech difficulties, no doubt, something I've done. All right, let me try this way. Okay. All right. All right. So what I want to do for you now is talk a little bit about the organization. I know we're pretty well known, but just a couple of things that I want to highlight. For the last 40 years, Archaeology Southwest has worked to identify, understand, and protect people's stories and their places across the land. Our founder, Bill Doley, way back in the late 80s, kicked all this off for us, and he called it preservation archaeology. I know there are others in the field, other outfits doing this, but I think the approach that Bill founded way back really is a good one. It's holistic. We work with what we believe is a very proven toolkit with investigation or research, collaboration with Indigenous groups and other local partners. We're very active in preservation and, of course, education. Through our programs, then collaborations, coalitions, and advocacy, and through our ever deepening relationships with tribes and other community partners, we aim to help share, restore, and steward the amazing places and stories that connect us to our human past. So that's where we want to be. Um, okay. The tech is defeating me a bit tonight. Let me
Let,
try one more thing here.
let me know if I can help with any.
Well, my my young man, I'm blessed with three sons, would say older people and technology. Um, we will let that one slide on by. Okay. Right here. All right. So, okay, good. We have functionality. Yay. All right. Well, dropping in, this is, of course, a beautiful aerial shot, Pueblo Bonito, the grandmother, the grandpappy of Chaco and Chacoan archaeology. So I want to begin with a little bit of a discussion here. Chaco is often, in my opinion, incorrectly described as, quote, a civilization. Okay. This is going to shock a few of you, perhaps, that I would disagree with this. But in particular, people talk about Chaco as a vanished civilization. And this, to my mind, is most incorrect. Now, I'm happy to say that this view mostly obtains in the past. And I'm speaking of the recent past. In other words, we're evolving out of this, but I am surprised myself how often I encounter folks who still choose to look at Chaco in this manner. And Chaco, of course, has been compared to other great places, amazing places in the past: Stonehenge, Newgrange, the pyramids, a variety of different places worldwide that we might choose to describe as ancient societies, maybe ancient civilizations. But with these other places, we have a lot of wonder about who actually built these places. So there's several major issues with thinking about Chaco this way, in my opinion. First and foremost, the descendants of the builders of Chaco and other ancient Pueblo sites across our region are literally all around us. They are the modern Pueblo people in New Mexico, in Arizona, and a group down in Texas. That is the Pueblo Isleta del Sur. So, if we're going to describe Chaco as a lost civilization, we are in fact disenfranchising the living descendant communities from their heritage. And for me, folks, that's the beginning and the end of why we should never do this again and really try hard not to think about it this way. Secondly, for me, the word civilization codes something really specific. And what that is a relic of a bygone era in American archaeology and history. Although clearly the term lives on, I don't think we're going to purge it. Now, the notion of civilization derives in general from sometime in the 19th century, perhaps, or even earlier, but with Europeans and Euro Americans approaching an understanding about world societies and cultures with a perspective that was largely focused on European values and beliefs and concerns. This process involved essentially putting all the societies worldwide on some kind of a continuum and then trying to rank them and evaluate, quote, their status, usually with regard to modern day European, perhaps Asian societies. This is an inherently racist and biased process since past European societies, with most of these rankings, particularly the Greeks and the Romans, always came out on the top. So this is another reason to I think abandon this term Now, derived from all this in this bias that we've attached to the idea of is the idea of quote history. Okay. Now we privilege written history, and there's some good reasons to do that. But while we're privileging the written word, we tend to denigrate oral histories. And this is a huge problem worldwide for Indigenous cultures, both present and past, because Indigenous cultures are to this day, many of them still largely based on the oral word. Now, our language reflects this. In archaeology, historically, I'll use that word, through when I came up, in the 80s, we put a hard divide between quote history and prehistory. And people make a big deal about this. And this history prehistory boundary varies a lot, but mostly is linked to when did Europeans pop into an area, right? So we could say we wanted that with the arrival of that fellow named Columbus in 1492, that quote history began, at least in the Caribbean. I see a real problem with this because, again, we're denigrating folks who don't have the written word, who still have very rich cultures and oral history. So these so-called pre-literate groups are then put on the sliding scale down as we think about quote civilization or advanced societies, and have been viewed then for centuries both pejoratively and described as primitive with other pejorative terms. Now, fortunately, in my mind, and I hope in many of yours, over the last few decades, many of us in anthropology, archaeology, in history, other cultural fields, certainly other disciplines as well, have pushed back against these outdated and racist ideas. So, doing that a little bit for you tonight. We do hear these things come up in different circles, and sometimes for me in surprising circles of folks that I would consider otherwise enlightened, shall we say, and well educated. And I think there is a surprising percentage of the current American population that still holds on to some of these ideas. Now, again, a consequence of this biased view, history, prehistory, civilization, non civilized, primitive, is that we have divorced historic and modern Indigenous groups from the amazing places of their own past that their ancestors created, settled, lived, and died in. Places like Chaco, of course, Cahokia out in the Midwest, east of St. Louis, and many, many others. So, having said that, I do want folks to understand that I have great appreciation for Chaco Canyon, its many wonders in the fields that we would break out today as architecture, astronomy, other arts, certainly pottery, weaving, textile production, um, as building sites, again, architecture, and socio-political organization. But I will tell you that tonight I'm not going to be focused on this idea of Chaco as a civilization. I want to talk about it as a living place. Okay, so um, let's take a look at a map here. There'll be a few maps, right? Sort of a standard archaeological warning for you. And there may be levels of complications that I can't explain to all of you. This one I hope is fairly straightforward. This is a map of the four modern American states we call the Four Corners, and it shows a number of the archaeological sites. Certainly not all of them tend to focus on special places in the National Park Service, as well as a few others. But more importantly for me, this map shows the modern descendant tribes who are arrayed on land, despite pressures of European colonization and other conflicts that have happened. They are arrayed all around these amazing ancient places. So, literally, when you visit archaeological sites, think of them, in my view, and in your own views, but then think about the modern groups who live all around them and those very, very strong connections, because we are very fortunate in the American Southwest to have these places of deep, great antiquity, and to have the tribes right here for us to go visit, to, if we're interested, purchase different things from the tribes, go and go to their dances, learn about their culture. Okay, so Pueblo Bonito and the sites in Chaco, of course, have fascinated people for hundreds of years, I think it's fair to say. This is a drawing by Richard Kern with the restoration of Pueblo Bonito. Now, Kern was on the 1849 expedition led by an individual named Lieutenant Simpson, who was dispatched to go study Chaco as part of a larger military operation not too long after um, the Americans came into possession of New Mexico. And Kern and his brother Edward, so Richard and Edward Kern, did a number of amazing drawings, some just straight, here's what it looks like, and other restorations of what the amazing places in Chaco look like. So I think the wonder of Chaco goes back certainly centuries, millennia, but the appreciation of it and the ability to look at the history of it is a couple hundred years old. Okay, so I'm not going to focus primarily on this tonight, but yes, Chaco Canyon is, and the Greater Chaco Landscape is again under threat. I'm going to circle back at the end and talk a little bit about how folks, in the seminar, the webinar tonight, and others can, try and make a difference if you're interested in doing that. It is pretty horrifying to me that we're back where we were. I jumped into this. We jumped into it as an organization in 2013. So, and it was in February. So, early next year, we'll be at 13 years having fairly direct involvement, and certainly other people's efforts, the Pueblo of Acoma, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, others of our partners at Wilderness, National Parks Conservation, their efforts go way back into the early 2000s. And yeah, flaring is a huge issue as we think about Chaco and the impacts. So I want folks to just kind of keep that in mind as we talk about what a wonderful place Chaco is. It is remote. It is well protected within the boundaries of the national park. But yeah, and with the current debate or move, I think pretty clear move by the current administration to get rid of a 10-mile zone of protection around Chaco, we could again have drilling rigs right on the boundary of Chaco. And we don't want to do that. Okay, well let's drop in a little bit into what I think anyway, and maybe other scholars, researchers feel are the major points, the important things about Chacoan society. Chaco and Pueblo and society was unique as we look all around the world at the way different groups, cultures, societies have arranged themselves. This group of people, related peoples, went through a lot of transition from way back in time. I mean, Chaco has sites that are in the Paleo Indian era, 10 to 12,000 years ago. There's not a whole lot. There's an archaic presence several thousand years ago. There's a huge Basque Omega 3 community, the way archaeologists, we like to give phase names and number things. But think of the 500s and 600s. Chaco was full of people practicing agriculture in an area where there hadn't been any agriculture to that for that time or before that time. So a pretty great place to do that. And then Chaco kind of hit its stride with the construction of what we think of as the great houses, which we will look at in some detail tonight. Beginning in the early to mid 800s, there was change, there was evolution, there was some transitioning. And the interesting thing about Chacoan society is there was a shift to the north in the late 1100s. So think 1070s, 1080s, 1090s, with the construction of the sites at Salmon, Pueblo. It's a family name, Salmon. It's not the fish. That's why I seem to be saying it wrong for those of you who may not know. And the very poorly named Aztec ruins, which I don't like the term ruin. My Pueblo colleagues and friends say these are living places. Aztec, of course, isn't a major site, well worth visiting. Aztec got the name because of the pioneers in the late 19th century and other people believing that these amazing sites, again, some with a very strongly racist notion, had to have been built by some other group of people who were no longer in the area. We know that's incorrect, even though Pueblo people did migrate out of the Four Corners in the 12th and 13th centuries. So this society ultimately went through transformations. People left the canyon. Some may have come in at later points in time. A lot of that power, that energy shifted to Solomon and Aztec, but Chaco was still a living Pueblo place through the 1200s. And of course, as I noted at the outset, Chacoan society and the people, the amazing remains, everything created is ancestral to all of the Hopi villages, all the 19 New Mexico Pueblos, and Isleta del Sur in El Paso, Texas. Okay, let's look at another map because this is what we love to do. This is a fairly complicated map. I don't expect in a couple of minutes this is all going to become crystal clear, but this is a map that we put together a few years ago with a magazine issue that we did, which, by the way, is available on our website for download if you're a member. And this was in 2018, so we're talking about the Chaco world, movements of people, how they traded different goods and items through that system. So this gives us a sense of spread of this amazing Chacoan society across the Four Corners states. This is an area roughly the size of the state of Indiana. As an Irish American descendant, it also has very, very similar acreage to the island of Ireland. Just to kind of pop that in there as a comparison. And the society, again, grew and changed and evolved over these many centuries. Sorry, another tech issue. Okay, so let's look at what it is that makes, again, think about all these places. There's about 200, 220-ish on this map. What makes these Chaco Great Houses special? What makes them unique? And let's kind of jump in. So this again, um, bird's eye view. It's been discussed by some researchers that we have these point locations, which is great. We can do some really very interesting geospatial work now. We can understand a lot of things. We can plug in population and see how that shifted. Again, inferences. But what is it about these sites, if we dig in a little deeper, that makes them special? Well, one of the things that I did with a study about 20 years ago now was to look at different classes of these Chaco and Great House sites, and to kind of see if I could begin to understand what the difference might be between the largest Chacoan sites, Pueblo Bonito, 700-ish rooms, Kettle right next door in the core, the central part of Chaco Canyon. Somewhat smaller sites at Aztec and Salmon, but 300, 400 rooms, and I came to feel that, okay, if folks built these places and they built 700 rooms, there's a reason for that. If they built a smaller site that had 200, there's a reason for that. If they built a site that had 50, a reason for that. So this for me then was, I guess, with the modern language of today, getting us into the weeds a little. But I didn't feel when I began working at Solomon, and I was fortunate to do that about 2001, and trying to understand this place as its own place, Solomon up on the San Juan River near the town of Bloomfield, but also as part of this Chacoan world. Why was Solomon about 250 to 300 rooms? Sites in Chaco, double that size, sites just down the river on the San Juan, much, much smaller. So, what could we decode about that? So, that's when I started to do another thing that archaeologists love to do, classify and create typologies. In this case, just hoping to kind of get a better understanding of what was going on. So I looked at the biggest structures, the largest ones, biggest of the big, one way to talk about it, mid-range structures with, say, greater than 75, about 200 rooms, and then the ones that were in the smallest class, below about 50 rooms. So I'm not sure those numbers have particular significance, but those of you who understand statistics at any level, we look for modes, right? Those are the occurrences. There's sites at this level, there's a cluster of data at this level, and one at this level. So this modal approach, I think, helped me get a sense of maybe what was going on. It's certainly something to ponder. So back to Pueblo Bonito, the biggest of the big, right? Big site, 700 rooms, depending upon how you count them. Right next door at Kettle, another very large site. Sorry, back to Bonito. So as we look at this, we have a site that is tiered, right? It's a Pueblo, so it's tallest at the back and then it slopes down. And so we got 5 stories at the back of Pueblo Bonito. At Kettle, probably 4 or potentially 5 stories at the back of this site, over 600 rooms, a number of round rooms, kiva structures. These are large, large sites that are in a class of their own. We come up to the middle San Juan area, around Farmington, Bloomfield, Four Corners. We come to Aztec West, another very large site, perhaps 450 rooms. One of the interesting things about Aztec historically, is folks started to encounter this site, with some of the earliest settlements in that area by pioneer farmers from different parts of the eastern U.S. This was in the 1860s and 70s. And there were tales that came out in those years of Aztec being perhaps 4 or 5 stories high and a lot more rooms than we might see today. A whole lot of rock sort of carted out through time. So an amazingly large place. The site that I spent a whole lot of time at working at Salmon, again, not a fish, but a site. And this one in the lower right, grainy gray, sepia tone photo. This is one of part of the amazing historical record that we have in different parts of the Southwest. A guy named Timothy O'Sullivan, who was a Civil War era photographer, was part of one of the Wheeler expeditions of 1874. They came up from Santa Fe, up Canyon Largo, hit the San Juan. They were interacting with Navajo and Hickory Apache folks and were told of this site. So they came down, and Sullivan took about a dozen wet plate photos of this that fortunately survived through time. Other photos from that era with that particular technology have vanished. So that gave us an insight into what this place looked like. Again, a really big, great house. So what's going on with these really big places? Well, to look at just those four that we were kind of dropping in on, what are we looking at for use of these places? And I want to start out talking about this issue by saying that as archaeologists, as people, as a person trained in a scientific tradition and a very European, Euro-American scientific tradition, I was trained to look at things and then do certain divisions and try to understand things by looking at, say, this class of data in landscape work, in construction, masonry, maybe I'm looking at pottery, maybe I'm looking at stone tools, etc. So those are useful approaches, I think. They can be in archaeology, obviously. But one of the things that I've learned over the last 15 years of working with a number of different Pueblo colleagues and friends, is that they have a much more integrated view of the world. And I think one of the things that we're missing as archaeologists in the scientific tradition is not being able to put all of these separate data classes that we have back together necessarily in the way that maybe we should. So I am going to talk to you about some of the differences and that I think about this site and that site, but I want you to keep in mind the idea that all of these sites, undoubtedly, in my mind, I'm not even going to put that out as a possibility. I think it's a high probability. These sites were integrated places, so they did function as residences. They function as ceremonial places. They function as places to hold resources, to do lithic work, to produce pottery. So all of those functions in there. Certainly different specializations at different times. But again, I think we need to think more about the integration, the integrated part of this. So Pueblo Bonito, an amazing, huge site, initially built with rooms arranged in suites that we see in other places earlier in time, later in time, at the same time, indicating strong residential function. It seems to have evolved into a more ceremonially focused elite residence, perhaps. Benito, at the end of its use life, for Pueblo people there, had more than 30 round ceremonial or medicine house type structures. Chetro Kettle, just right next door to it, a mix of use. But the layout of this site suggests, to me at least, primary use as a residence. There are really consistent room suites. We look at Aztec West, built just a few years after at about 1100 to 1120. Again, this mix of ceremonial residential functions. Aztec with sites, great houses in 4 different places in that landscape ultimately came to rival and perhaps replace Chaco. And Salmon Pueblo, built as the first and largest site at 1090, before Aztec. So Aztec went on to become a larger place on the landscape. But Salmon built primarily as a residential site with also that strong ceremonial connection. Okay, so let's drop down and look at just some maps here and a couple photographs of some other sites that are kind of in this next class down. So what's going on with some of these places? This site is just downriver from Aztec, towards Farmington and Shiprock. It's a very large site. Fortunately, held in private hands, but fortunately not impacted by a whole lot of disturbance at this point, and does not seem to have been largely pot hunted. It's intact, was never the focus of a major archaeological project. This is one that many people have tried to work with places like the Archaeological Conservancy, other land conservancies, to see if they could get it into those hands. The owners have so far been resistant to that, but that's something that some efforts are continuing at. This is the site at North 41. This is all the way up near the Colorado border at the far end of the La Plata Valley. This was an amazing great house that unfortunately, folks, disappeared under a bulldozer in about a week in the late 1980s. Literally, archaeologists had gotten interested during the original project at Salmon in the 1970s. Folks had gone up, gotten permission to do the couple of test trenches that you see illustrated on this map. A little bit of work. A later landowner decided that there was too much interest from archaeologists and the government, and he was simply going to bulldoze the site. This, unfortunately, folks, is the tale of too many large, amazing sites across our Four Corners region. the La Plata Valley, extending from the west end of Farmington all the way up to the Colorado line along, the La Plata River Creek is unfortunately a sad tale of development and those kinds of things without any public protection for any of those lands. Now, one of the sites I'm going to talk about has passed into Archaeological Conservancy hands. We'll talk about that in a minute. In fact, it's right here. Couldn't remember where this one was loaded. The Holmes Group is a community about 15 miles up the La Plata River from the modern town of Farmington. This is a site with more than 100 structures, folks, 100 pueblos or ceremonial places, kivas, by-wall structures. There are two great houses right in the middle of it that were paired, built at about the same time with very interesting remains. The northern one appearing more Chacoan in some of its attributes, the southern one appearing more linked to the local San Juan culture in terms of pottery and building style. But this takes us into the small great house category. Both of these sites, 35, 40 rooms over a couple of stories. So the reason you build a site like that compared to a site with 300, 400, 800 rooms, very different reasons in my mind. The interesting thing that we see as we look at this small great house pattern, if it's not too oxymoronic, in particular, is these structures occur in pre-existing Pueblo communities that Chacoan migrants then came into, built great house sites to partner, in my opinion, become part of that community. But the communities continue to have a lot of folks still living in smaller places around them. That's very different from the concentration of population that we see at places like Solomon. Aztec has a number of smaller sites as well, but it is a different pattern that we see unfolding in some of these places. This is one out to the west towards Shiprock along the San Juan River called Hogback. A very small site, about 10 rooms on this ground story with an enclosed circular kiva structure, a couple rooms on a second story, built for a very different reason. This is the residence for a family, perhaps a family of direct Chaco and migrants coming up to become part of a community, to partner, to allow those folks then to join the Chacoan world in these social networks, the political networks, the trading networks. Hogback, interestingly, is a definite great house site, but it's surrounded by many, many small pueblos. So again, this community pattern that's much more dispersed. Newcomb is a site about halfway down the Chusca Valley. If you go to Shiprock and then go south down the highway that is today known as 491, you get the Newcomb community. This is a very similar site and layout if we pop back, right? We've got rooms and a block and then an enclosed plaza focused kiva structure. Newcomb also has dozens of small pueblos in a community that stretches out along a ridge with farmlands down below. Okay, so thinking about then some of the diversity that we see in this Chacoan system, and if we want to think about it in any way as a unified type of system, which I think there's some genuine question marks there. How can we best see this? In my opinion, I believe that we have a union of distinct ethnic and biosocial groups who are going out on the landscape, some living already in those areas, others migrating to and founding new settlements in areas without Pueblo affiliated peoples. But they're all connected in this larger Chacoan system, and they all can probably be grouped in this fairly large category of ancestral Pueblo people. But they're definitely not single, in my opinion, a single unified group of people. They probably didn't speak a single language. If we look at Pueblo people today, we have 5 language groups represented. So if we think about Chacoan people migrating to different areas, this reflects differences in both the groups migrating from Chaco and the peoples they encountered in those new areas, who again were perhaps Pueblo affiliated in some cases, though they may not have been sedentary farmers until they had contact with folks coming actually from Chaco. So the idea is this was a very heterogeneous system that wasn't anything resembling, even though people like this analogy a lot, the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was very unified. The Romans went out, they built roads to areas, they conquered those areas, and then they built architecture that looked the same all over. And yes, there are similarities in Chacoan architecture, but Once we get beyond the great house sites, we see a whole lot of that variation. So just one thing to think about. So with the small great houses, then again, built with a very strong mental template, hogback nukem. So I think it's clear that there was a very strong template that people are following, but then there was what I've come to think of as sort of idiosyncratic variation within those models and how different local groups met the needs that they had as they went through that process. Okay, so if we drop in on another place, this is going to get us into a little bit of a discussion of the 10-mile zone and why that's important, why we care about it, and why we need to continue to protect it. So we drop in on the Pierre's Chacoan outlier. This is a great house. This is actually has three, well, 2.5 to 3 different great house segments, very small sites, 15 or 20 rooms each. You can see this one on the top of the screen with some pot hunting impacts. Unfortunately, the one on the right is in an elevated mesa top setting. The highest point, 2-story architecture, again, maybe 20 rooms here. Where the photograph was taken then in the foreground is another component of this great house that was placed on top of this mesa. I was fortunate to visit many of these places at different points across the Greater Chaco landscape over the last 10, 12 years with different representatives of Pueblo nations. So I partnered particularly closely with elders, cultural leaders, tribal historic preservation office folks from Pueblos of Zuni and Acoma. So we designed and we got funding for 2 separate small projects that allowed us to go out and experience places on the landscape. One of the more special moments for me was at this place, which is a site known as Guadalupe that we went into, and the Zuni team immediately connected with this place, recognizing it from what they understood through their own oral history. So that was, for me, a particularly special moment. We also visited other sites. This is the site at Pueblo Pintado, which is protected as part of the Greater Chaco Landscape and the Chaco National Park System. The Zuni men had been in and around this region, had not been able to visit this place. So we had some time one particular day, and we were able to drop in and have them reconnect with another special place that was known to them through their oral history and their songs. So B mentioned this as we were doing the introduction. We've got funding from a couple of private groups in 2022 when the initial move came up to protect the zone around Chaco. This is something, again, that various environmental groups, our organization, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, many of the individual Pueblos, particularly at Acoma and Zuni, had been talking about doing. So we got funding to create a short film, just under 7 minutes, featuring Pueblo and Navajo leaders talking about why Chaco and the region around Chaco was so important to them in terms of their heritage. So this is a pretty easy find. If you haven't seen this, it's on our website. It can be easily brought up on YouTube with this link, and or just protecting Chaco's 10-mile zone. This is something that we created, again, with amazing filmmaker David Wallace and his company, David Wallace Visuals, to try to project and really get a strong visual out. We can do different things in the audio world. We can certainly do the printed word, short versions, longer versions, but films, I think, do have a special impact. So if you haven't been able to see this, I hope you'll get a chance to check it out. The other thing that we did during this interval in 2020, I was able to get funding to go into the area that had been proposed as a mineral withdrawal zone in Chaco's 10-mile. And you can see the kind of irregular shape that evolved through different negotiations. I accessed site records from the state of New Mexico to see what general site densities would look like. We moved these sites around by hundreds of kilometers, blurred the images, so we're not giving away point locations, but this is to illustrate the density of sites, There's at least 4,200 known sites in this large area that was going to be withdrawn. With looking at survey coverage from different projects, either research projects, cultural resource management, development projects, et cetera. And with roughly 15% of the area surveyed, over 4,000 sites. So if those percentages were to hold, we would be getting upwards of 20,000 sites. So certainly a very important, significant resource. And that's one of the reasons when I talk about this mineral withdrawal zone, in this roughly 10-mile, these four connected 10-mile zones, I don't talk about this as a buffer. I talk about it as a protection zone. Yes, we're trying to protect the national park. There can be no drilling under our current legislation and laws in any national park. National monuments are a different matter, and they can have many different oil and gas and other mining impacts. But we could have drilling again right up to the edge of Chaco Canyon, and that's something that it's hard for me to understand why anyone would be in favor of that. There's certainly other issues to think about. In this area around Chaco, there are a number of individually held allotments. And there are ways for folks to lease their lands on allotments to development companies. And there's been quite a bit of that that's happened since about 2009, 2010. With this mineral withdrawal, we're talking strictly about the federally managed lands. So all those Navajo Lati folks would still have the opportunity to lease their lands if they chose to. So, but there has been a lot of misinformation flying around in the public. And so we do our best, I guess, to just get the best possible information out. What I was able to do with some folks helping me was to go out into these different areas, particularly on the north side where the development had really been pretty severe, not quite well into the 10-mile zone, but between the 10 to 15-mile zone was where the Mancos Shale in particular was producing a lot of oil from, say, 08 to about 2015. So I went in to look at these places. We didn't walk thousands of acres as part of this project, but we did spot checking, essentially a reconnaissance project, and then pulling all the site records, building a number of maps. So I put together a pretty good sized report that then went in when the Farmington office of the BLM was thinking about how to manage future leasing. Unfortunately, that process, which is basically was a resource management plan development process, took 12 years and then was abandoned with no outcome. So sometimes in the environmental preservation world, we put in a lot of time and we don't have any decision. They have indicated that under the current administration, the current Secretary of the Interior and BLM, they're going to start another resource management plan process sometime in 26. So that's something that us and our partners, tribal partners, everyone is going to be paying a lot of attention to. The point here is that there are tons and tons of sites, folks, in this zone that, we don't want to dismiss as a buffer. We want to talk about protecting the park, and we want to talk about the sites in there. So this area in the Pierres community has 166 sites in not that big of an area. This is a pretty dense community. The portions affiliated with the Pierres, Pueblo, Chaco, part of the phenomenon is about 75% of this. The other sites go all the way from Middle Archaic to very recent, and actually a couple of 200 or 300-year-old Dene or Navajo sites in there. So quite interesting. The BLM has designated an area of environmental concern, critical environmental concern, that protects a portion of this. But you can see from where this boundary is drawn to encompass the sites we know about, there are a number of places that are not actively being protected. And then this just gives you a sense of that as well. This is an amazing aerial photographic map that my colleague and friend, Dr. Kellum Throgmorton, put together as part of the study that we did. And this just gives you a sense of the density and the spread of resources. And this is really just a sample of the sites, the resources that are affiliated with the Pierres Great House. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to talk to you all about. If you haven't been to Chaco somehow, go out, please visit. And if you want to help in this effort to protect it, take a look at the information I have on this screen. We don't yet have information on when they're going to move to revoke the mineral withdrawal in this zone around Chaco. It has been stated as a good eventuality possibility. They're apparently considering some alternatives, but some of what we've heard has been fairly clear. They have sort of floated the idea of a short 14-day comment or protest period, which is incredibly short. We are now at what, Christmas Eve. So we're hoping that this process can be pushed into January. There'll be time for folks post holidays to really concentrate on it. You can visit our website at this link or others. You can also go to one that's maintained by Pew Charitable Group, one of our partners, that's protectchaco.org. As soon as more information is available, we'll be updating these sites, and certainly reach out to me at any point in time for more information. And I want to thank you all for listening. I will say I haven't done a Zoom style lecture since COVID, so it's a bit interesting to have the disembodied audience. My wife was going to set up some stuffed animals and pull in, I thought, well, maybe my cat could, come and sit by, you know, on the table near me. But again, thank you for paying attention. I'm going to go to the last slide here and hand it back to B. Thank you very much.
Oh, wonderful, Paul. We're so honored that you're doing your first post-COVID Zoom with us. I make my partner stand behind my camera and then I present, pretend that I'm presenting to someone. All right. So are you ready and willing to do some Q&A? We have a bunch of questions, as you would imagine.
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, let's jump into it. So we probably, like I said, won't get to all of these, everyone, but I will follow up with answers to them via an email. So the first question for you, Paul, is there any further thought or information regarding Stephen Lexon's idea of the Chaco Meridian? For example, is it deliberate? If so, how did they do it? And if so, what was its purpose?
Well, short history then. I imagine that the individual to question knows this, but Steve's original book came out in '99, and then a couple of years ago he did a second edition, sort of reiterating some of the points, adding a little bit of data. From my own perspective, the Meridian idea and concept was very helpful as I came up to Solomon to begin work. To sort of help the organization there at what's known as the San Juan County Museum Association, who manages the Solomon Ruins Museum, finish a report that had sat for a little bit of time. And I was thinking about the movement of peoples out of Chaco to Solomon and Aztec, et cetera. So I found Steve Lexon's idea about northern movement, very helpful. And I took some of that and used it. The idea of a line like the Meridian having significance beyond sort of individual specific things that we might document is not something that I am able to really wrap my head around that much, especially the southern part of it going all the way down through the Mimbres country and down to Paquime in northern Chihuahua. So I wouldn't consider myself an advocate really of that view, but I would encourage the individual at the question to track down Steve Lexon. Steve does a lot of things. He's a prolific writer. He's written so many different things about Chaco, and that's where I would point folks.
All right, excellent. So next question for you. You already touched upon this a little bit, but does Chaco fall within the land claims of Pueblo, Navajo, Hopi, or other peoples, and who can present or prevent oil and gas exploratory development there? Anything you wanted to
Yeah,
add with that?
yeah, Chaco is definitely part of the ancestral lands of every Pueblo group. As I laid out at the beginning and then kind of reiterated at different points. And it's surrounded by, the Navajo Reservation stops west of Chaco. So different lecture for sure, but originally the Navajo Reservation pushed further east all the way to Cuba, New Mexico. And then with different negotiations and changes the boundary got moved back. By that time, a lot of Navajo Dene families had settled in that portion of the San Juan Basin. So those folks were given allotments under the Dawes Act of the 1880s. And so there are a number of essentially private parcels there that are part of what the Navajo Nation considers their exterior boundaries, but are actually off reservation lands. So we call it the checkerboard for that reason. There's mixed Navajo, some tribal trust, Navajo Alati lands, other private that's not tribally related, state trust lands, about 7, 8, 9%. So it's a very difficult area to manage and to advocate for because of that checkerboard status. So this land withdrawal that happened was focused on the about 20% of the federal surface. The feds control about 45%, if I have the numbers right, of the subsurface mineral estate. So that's a slightly larger portion of that territory, but most of the surface is not within federal hands or control. So unfortunately, the advocacy and protection issues have to be pursued by the individual Pueblos, Navajo individuals who have that concern, the All Pueblo Council of Governors, other larger umbrella organizations, ours, the environmental groups. But there's no land claim information specifically that bears on this for the Pueblo descendants of Chaco.
All right. Excellent. And next question. Similar to the layout of Casas Grande and southern New Mexico pueblos, do you think the architecture represents kinship or closely related family groups that sometimes maintain consanguineous relationships, as we see in the DNA genetics of some South American groups now at Pacume?
What I've come to understand through listening to my Pueblo friends and colleagues in particular over the last decade plus is that Pueblo people, Pueblo affiliated people, um, in their minds, we're all over literally the greater Southwest. They don't believe that the international border, as many of us don't, is certainly it's a modern political thing. And there are pretty important pieces of Pueblo oral history talking about groups going way down to the south, to Casas Grandes, and even further down. So I don't have any doubt that there are connections across those different areas. Trying to get more specific about that is not something that I see us, being able to do at this point, because it is people have moved a number, so many different times over the last 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 years. So there's a whole lot of movement there. So, but I definitely feel that the way we as modern Euro Americans and the different jurisdictions that indigenous people have come under have said, okay, you're a tribe, you stay here. None of that really makes sense from an indigenous point of view, if I'm understanding that correctly at all, because those boundaries were very fluid. And the tribes that again, were mostly in some ways dictated by outside European powers, may or may not have existed in the past. So, we talk about different social identities and tribal identities, and I think it was a lot more diverse and complicated with a lot more variation than most of the models that archaeologists certainly have really can accommodate.
Okay, and this next question you answered a little bit, but this one came in when you were talking about different sites and for example, the one that was unfortunately bulldozed fairly recently. So individuals can, in some instances, own this land.
The United States is one of the few countries on the globe that allows people to own even, huge cultural resources, historic
Mhm.
sites, archaeological sites, indigenous sites, simply by buying the land. Most countries protect their cultural heritage, and certainly land ownership is a thing all around the world. But if there's a
Mhm.
cultural site, then protections are put in place. In America, those have to be hard fought. We have to have easements put in place that are durable through multiple ownership, or we have to raise money and have groups like the Archaeological Conservancy that now owns, I think, sites in 48 or 49 of our states, which is great, but they have to literally go on the market and negotiate with owners when properties come up and then fundraise and buy those places. So it's to my mind a tragedy that people can purchase archaeological and historic sites and essentially mine them and then sell pottery on eBay. And then there are people who pay a lot of attention to that. But if it can be certified from private land through whatever means, there's no laws that forbid that. So we have to be very vigilant because a lot of times people will pot hunt on public lands or state lands or tribal lands and then falsify documents showing that, this is from private. So it's a huge problem. And unfortunately it's not going away.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We still have 28 more questions in the Q&A. So as I said, I am going to follow up and get you answers to all of those with Paul after the holidays here. So keep an eye out for that email. But I do want to let you know before we end a little bit of what's next with the Conservancy. So before I say that, a huge thank you to everyone who joined us and to Paul for such a wonderful presentation, and Paul for the work that you have done, continue to do, your collaboration with the tribes, the community, partners like us across the Greater Chaco Landscape. We are so thankful to you. So talking about what's coming up next, and so you all can stay tuned. On this slide, you'll see a link to our events. If you go to that link on our site, we have two events coming up in January. Our next lecture series is going to be the state of the parks. That is going to feature Denise Robertson, who's the superintendent at both Chaco and Aztec, as well as me, talking about what's coming up in 2026 at the parks, how the parks did in 2025, just kind of a snapshot of the state of the parks. We are also going to kick off our book club, which is going to be on Zoom as well, the discussion. So we are currently reading our first choice, Canyon Gardens, Ancient Pueblo Landscapes, with guest host and facilitator of that discussion, John Gihate, who is a Pueblo member and a wonderful board member of the Conservancy. That will be on January 21st. Coming up in spring, we have some more Zoom lectures. Dr. Carrie Heitman will be joining us. Many of you already know her from her film Hopi Pottery Connections Through Time. She'll be joining us in March to talk about that project along with some Hopi artists who will be featured from the film. We don't have which artists quite yet, or I would be announcing their names as well. But once we get that confirmed, I will post that event. And then in April, Dr. Steve Lexon will join us. So save that question you had about the Chaco Meridian and you can ask it to him in April. So this lecture series is just getting started and we're really excited to keep building with you. I welcome your feedback, thoughts for speakers in the future. How to stay connected with us as we go forward. Stay connected on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and sign up for our newsletter through our website. I'll be posting the recording from tonight along with other event videos on YouTube, and welcome you to share those conversations with others who might be interested in Chaco. And last but not least, if you are feeling energized and inspired from tonight's talk, you're looking for a way to turn that into action, I just want to share this one last thought with you all. Our parks need our support more than ever. I'm sure you have heard and know that. Chaco and Aztec are extraordinary places, and they require constant care between the preservation projects, education programs, infrastructure repairs, everyday maintenance. All of that goes to keep these landscapes protected and accessible. But it does cost a lot of money, work, and effort for our park staff and conservancy. So what can you do to help? You can start by making a donation to the parks using the link or the QR code on this slide. If you're able to, we would be deeply, deeply grateful for your support, and any amount truly helps. So with that, I will close this out for tonight and say thank you all again so much for being here, for caring about Chaco, Aztec, and the Greater Chaco Landscape, and for being a part of this community. And we hope to see you again very, very soon. Happy holidays, everybody.